Okay guys, so now we're gonna talk a little bit about integration testing, and yeah, that's pretty much it, so let's get into it. So we're gonna cover one of the most boring things with integration test, and a suggestion that I can give to you for making things slightly easier than they may be. So let's just get the obvious stuff out of the way. A integration test or something like that, it's kind of hard to define these sorts of things, but usually an integration test or an end-to-end test or something like that is just in general you trying to figure out if some part of your system is actually working. Now, the main difference between this and a unit test is that a unit test is usually just a test of pure logic, whereas a real integration test is a little bit more elaborate than that. Some people like to do API tests and like call that an integration test, where you do some mocking in memory without actually accessing the database and so forth. But for this discussion, we're going to call it something that an integration test, something where you actually access the database and you actually persist some sort of state. Now, the downside of using this sort of approach is that it takes a lot longer to run a test that goes to the database. So usually the thing you want is to have a small suite of these tests that tests some part of your application where you actually do need a database state of some sort, but you should favor as much as humanly possible to basically keep everything in memory. But what for those situations when you actually need the database? So something that is a bit tedious when doing database or integration testing or in end-to-end testing is to create that state. Especially when you're running end-to-end tests, you want to go to your application, start up, run a test, and click through the application to make sure that the user's experience is going to be what you want it to be, right? But there's a lot of time that goes into just creating that boilerplate state and setting that up. So I'm going to show you a approach to making this a little bit simpler for you. So let's just walk through the code first and foremost. So here we have a server, an Express server. It's fairly standard, like we're using Mongo's and a MongoDB instance, but you can see here that we actually have two servers, and we're going to touch on that in just a moment. But the basic idea here is that I have my application server, and then just for testing purposes, I have this thing that I call an integration server. And let's have a look here. We see here that you can see here that I use Cypress for my end-to-end testing, but I also have I run Jest for my unit testing and integration testing and things like that. So we have a bit of a mixed bag here for testing. And let's close that down here. And then we have this simple little server, which is just my application, where you can see here with some basic models. And then I basically just have two endpoints. One where you can get the HTML page and one where you can do an API call, which is kind of arbitrary. Like, this stuff isn't all that important. And then some HTML that is going to be returned, right? This isn't all that interesting. So apart from that, we have our models here, we have a book, we have an order, we have some users, and then we have our test here, right? So what I want to focus on now is the actual setting up of my tests here. So let's look at the first test suite we have. So we are running this this test here. As you can see here, we're going to do an application test, right? And before we start, we're going to spin up our database, we're going to start our server, and then we're going to start something called an integration server, and then we do some cleanup after that, and that's about it. So here we have a test that says that it should return an empty array if no order is placed. And this is where a classic example. Okay, I want now to be able to call an endpoint on my server. I want to start my server, I want to make an endpoint request, and I want to assert something, right? But as you can see, like, this would be a fairly straightforward thing, right? Should return an empty array if no order is placed. But I know that an order is connected to my user's ID. So in order for me to be able to even create this order, I need to create the user first, because I need a ID of some sort to attach to. I could just fake it, but it would be easier for me if there was a user. I could just use that user ID, and that would be the whole story, right? And then we have something similar where I should get all orders for a user. The same sort of thing comes back here. Okay, so I want to make sure that I want to grab all the orders that exist for a user. So now if I'm hitting this orders API endpoint here, I just want to make sure that I'm actually going to get the thing that I want, right? But in order for this to work, I need to be able to, well, I could, I said previously, I could just fake this. I could mock off all of this, and if I wanted to, and maybe that is the way to go. But in certain circumstances, in this one, and maybe in a situation such as with a end-to-end test, I actually want to use the database. So creating what I call a state builder is a very convenient thing to use in order to make this a little bit easier. So you can see here that I have this thing that I call a builder. And the basic principle behind it is very simple. So the builder's job is, it is a builder pattern technically. So all it does is that it exposes these methods such as create user, create book, and then we have something called execute. And we're going to touch on that in just a moment. And the principle is that I can create a user, and then I get a new I get the same reference back to the builder, and then I can create a book, and then I can call execute, which executes all of these commands in sequence. And then it basically returns a promise where I can destructure out the returning models. So as an example here, you can see here that I wanted to create a bunch of books and a user. So I have a builder, I create the user, then I create some books, and then I execute. The return values are going to be, I can destructure out now and be certain that they come back in the right order, right? So now I have my models here, right? And here's my array of books. And now I want to create an order. And the order takes in an object where I just pass in the user ID, which is this, and some books, and then I call execute again. So this builder is just a utility for testing purposes that allows me to build up the state that I need in order to execute my test. It's not production code, it's not intended to be used by a user or something. It's just something that I use in order to make my testing go simpler. I would never ever include this into like a real application. And that's the reason why I have this on a separate service. This is a little bit misleading because this would have, I mean, if I ship this code, this server would actually be running, but just use your imagination here. This server should never be included with production code because it holds the most powerful endpoints that I have. So let's look at those endpoints. This is my integration server that my builder is connecting to. So let's have a look here. It's also just a server, and you can see it uses the same models as the main application. And then I have this thing here called /user that simply calls create with whatever I send to it. Books, same thing. Whatever I send to it is going to be the thing that I try to create as a book model and then an order model. And then I have this thing called /clear where I can delete all the different models based on what I need to delete, or I can just default to deleting everything in the database, right? So I can do some cleanup. So what this lets me do basically is to have this single interface where I can, as you see here, I can actually clear my database after I'm done with all my testing, and I can build up my states and all that stuff. Like this, it makes it a lot easier for me to just create the state that I want. I have the same thing here for some Cypress test where I can reuse it in it can be used for any purposes as long as the server is running, right? So if I start the server, I can start by clearing all of my data, and here I have my builder. I create a user, and in this case I give it I give the user name of foo, and then I give the name of bar to my other user. I call execute, and then because Cypress doesn't at this time have support for async await, I just execute my logic, right? So I can run these tests. Let's have a look here. I still think I have my tests running here. So like this. And then I run my test and everything is hunky-dory. Yeah, exactly. So now my very basic test has executed and everything looks like it should, right? So this is because otherwise I would have had to basically depend on creating a bunch of services and like business logic and stuff like that and leverage production code when I don't really have to. I can just short circuit everything or rather take this little shortcut. So let's look at the state builder. So the basic idea of a state builder, or like you can call it whatever you want, right, is that we have some command here and there's a URL and a body, and basically all it is just a class that holds a list of commands. And so here's my first command, create users, or create user, that takes in a bunch of props. The reason why I give it an object is because I want to be flexible here. I want it to be an optional thing, and I don't want, like, because a user model can change quite drastically over time. So I just want to take in like everything, so I can set pretty much anything I want, right? And then I declare my body, and here you see a bunch of optional I can give it a specific name if I want to, but otherwise it's going to default to some reasonable thing that is random enough, right? So I can just call it without actually having to state anything. If I just want like a random user, just create a random user, and that's the entire story, right? And all it then does is that it pushes this command, this body that I want to send to this endpoint, to my list of commands, and then it returns this, which is a reference back to the same instance, right? And create book works the same way, and then we have create order, does the same thing, right? And then we have clear, which we saw earlier. All that's going to do is it's going to take a query parameter of some sort and try to delete all of those models, right? And then finally we have our execute function, and all this does is that it maps over all of the commands, and it calls, well, post. It just goes through all of these and just posts all of the commands, and then clears them, and yeah, that's pretty much it, really. So and then I just clear my commands here, as you can see, and then I await all of the promises that I have created, and then I get my responses. And since I'm using Axios, I just do a basic mapping here, so I just get back the data. So this is a way that I can guarantee that, all right, I run all of my commands after I've declared them. When I call execute, I'm going to run one by one all of these commands, and I'm going to get them to, like, in a synchronized manner back into something that I can destructure, as you saw earlier. This, I think, is one I really like, this, where I can just destructure out all of the models that I just created in the same sequence as I created them. And yeah, this is my little tip. I find this very, very useful when I do integration testing. It saves me a lot of pain, and just makes everything a lot easier for me when it comes to building up my state before I'm doing my testing. So I hope you found this useful. Have a great day.